I'm Richard Syrett. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. Beginning in December 2010, a series of supposed spontaneous populist uprisings, both violent and nonviolent, began to take hold across the Middle East. By December 2013, rulers had been forced from power in Tunisia, twice in Egypt, Libya, and Yemen. Several uprisings erupted in Bahrain. Protests erupted in Algeria, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Morocco, and Sudan. A bloody civil war continues to rage in Syria. But were these protests and revolutions in fact spontaneous and populist? Did these uprisings actually pit ordinary men and women fighting for democratic reform against corrupt and barbaric regimes? Is Syrian President Bashar al-Assad an evil, corrupt tyrant as he's being portrayed in the West? Or is Assad telling the truth when he contends the civil war now tearing his country apart was started by outside insurgents, funded and armed by the United States, NATO, and their Arab allies in the region? On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we'll explore the possibility that the Arab Spring was in fact a hoax, a series of stage-managed events, a fake. We're about to meet an historian and noted critic of American foreign policy, a Lebanese-born economics professor, and a counterintelligence expert who all contend that in many cases these revolts were manufactured. Essentially, Western-backed coups d'etats designed to create cooperative regimes or client states in the region. And we'll meet a skeptic, a prominent Iranian Kurdish scholar and researcher who contends the Arab Spring that swept across the Middle East was, for the most part, the result of a demographic time bomb. The population in Arab countries more than doubled between 1975 and 2005 to 314 million. In Egypt, 2/3 of the population is under 30. Political and economic development in most Arab states simply could not keep up with the staggering increase in the population, as the ruling elite's incompetence helped lay the seeds for their own demise. Me, I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads, down the road to Damascus if necessary. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid? That's how cynical I am now about the process. Is it possible technology can alter weather patterns
created by the corporation?
Has been engineered by the Illuminati?
There's no doubt.
The Arab Spring, by and large, is a fake. These are not revolutions. They're at most insurrections, but really just palace coups, putches behind the scenes by the CIA with some street demonstrations in the foreground as camouflage. In other words, the enemies of the CIA, the people that the CIA is interested in destabilizing or bringing down or whatever it is. So that's the beginning. In the case of Ben Ali, everything works fine. You get some golden youth in the public square. This is the upper middle class privileged kids. They get out there, they agitate, they've got Jasmine, they've got a new slogan. But then the key moment is the military coup, the putsch, which has been set up by the CIA. So when Ben Ali goes to the general staff, he says, "Will you support me?" They say no, and he's gone.
The question is, how did this popular uprising that started on such a correct way have transformed into so much violence and had been co-opted by so many forces? It's neither Arab, because all parts of the world are now converging on the region and have their hands meddling in the affairs of the Arab world, from the Russians to the Americans, to the Turks, to the Saudis, to the Iranians, French. There isn't a single power that has not come to the region, and it's not spring. But no matter what name you give it, something great has happened, but something awful has also transpired.
In other words, the leaders of a whole bunch of countries were destabilized and ousted. So then they could then bring in people who are more pliable, more puppet-like, and so forth. The problem with that is, though, and this is the problem with the CIA always, is that you put in a puppet, and as 10 or 20 years go by, the puppet begins to act more like the leader of a nation. So there's this constant, restless desire to destabilize, to oust, to overthrow.
The argument is basically that if you can create the impression, whether true or not, that a government has turned against its own people and is carrying out human rights violations, that government loses its sovereignty and should be targeted for external intervention for regime change. Former General Wesley Clark recounted a conversation that he had with Paul Wolfowitz, who was then a deputy to Dick Cheney at the Pentagon. And Wolfowitz calmly told him that there were 7 or 8 countries that had been allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and that all of those countries were targets for regime change. Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia. This target list has remained a constant throughout this entire prolonged period, and I think that the checklist is getting shorter and shorter. I believe that the reason that Gaddafi was targeted and was overthrown was because he was also the gateway for China to make major inroads throughout the African continent.
In the first few days in Egypt, when Mubarak was having trouble, the Americans and the West offered to bring a change, knowing that they have such strong relationship with the security organization, the army and the police and others. They felt like, okay, maybe we get rid of Mubarak, but we maintain the pillars of the regime. These pillars are fundamentally and totally and strongly tied to Western interests.
Mubarak is tougher, he hangs on longer, he doesn't want to quit, but then some kind of terrible threat arrived overnight. Maybe the seizure of the Suez Canal, so that he decided to quit, and this allowed then Field Marshal Tantawi and General Annan to have a coup d'etat in Egypt.
It's definitely the case that before the first revolt began in Tunisia, the president had signed off on a policy that the U.S., if situations arose of popular revolts, that the U.S. would support bringing the Muslim Brotherhood into power. That's what happened in Tunisia. That's what happened in Egypt. That was the directionality in Syria. That's in effect what's been going on in Libya. So Obama played the Muslim Brotherhood card on a global scale. It blew up massively in his own face.
Egypt was quite loyal to the United States. The Egyptian army was funded by the United States, $3 billion a year. It's a lot of support. President Mubarak was very pro-American and had good relations with Israel, which is important for the United States, has good relations with the Arab world, had no enmity, serious one with Turkey or Iran. That, of course, the U.S. wouldn't like. But basically, there is no reason why the United States should topple Mubarak.
Libya is a very different ball game in many respects. Foreign powers, NATO, were willing to come with their air force, hitting the Libyan army and changing the balance of power on the ground, intervening in a civil war and changing the outcome of that uprising. What started as people wanting to get more freedom and a regime to become more flexible and responsive to their wishes, ultimately the uprising took a different turn and started unraveling into a regime change one. A regime change that did not come just from the people in Libya, but by foreign powers coming directly, intervening with their superior military power and air power. They killed 40,000 Libyans. This was not a benign intervention.
So I think that's the question. Most of these cases in the Middle East, we don't see any reason why the United States, which is the main power still in the region, would destabilize one of these countries or the region by driving people into the streets.
What you see is the infantry for the U.S. in the destabilization of Libya is al-Qaeda. It shows what al-Qaeda really is at the most basic level. It's the CIA Arab Legion, and you've got all these foreign fighters in Libya coming from other Arab countries that have been brought in precisely by al-Qaeda. So that's the reality.
I believe that the reason that Gaddafi was targeted and was overthrown was because he was also the gateway for China to make major inroads throughout the African continent. So this was an invasion and overthrow in the classic Cold War sense of the word, and China and Russia were basically lied to, double-crossed, and in China's case, they lost massive investments throughout the African continent as the result.
Libya is the most developed country in Africa. It beats Russia, Ukraine, Brazil, and quite a few others in terms of the level of economic development. And that's Gaddafi. So whatever you think about him, right? Oppressor, yeah, whatever, authoritarian. But look at that achievement. In other words, what Gaddafi did was he used the oil income to a large degree for the benefit of the entire population. If you got married in Libya, you got a house given to you. A social safety net that in the United States you can only dream of.
It's true that there was some degree of welfare for the people in Libya. But really, the one thing that bothers the people in the region, and I would say everywhere, is extreme despotism. It's not just material welfare. When libraries are controlled, students are controlled, women are controlled, you are in a state of total domination. You feel it every moment more than hunger. I've been in a situation like this. You want to be hungry but free. And that's the reason in many of these country people all of a sudden they explode.
There is here a huge investment. Fighters, money, even at one time came close to using direct power in order to change the regime. Syria, it started as a very localized, legitimate, civilian demanding a regime change to allow a greater participation of people. And the regime reacted in a very bloody way.
There was a Syrian spring in 2000, the year 2000. You know, there's lots of activism among intellectuals and opposition politicians, but this was again suppressed. So there was resentment among the population. Just look at the images of the cities. Entire neighborhoods have been destroyed. How can a regime do this to its own people? So there's serious questions. I think the numbers are, even if they were 10,000, were still significant. But you know, Bashar Assad's father killed about 30,000. Again, these figures, no one has taken census of it, but that's what the Syrians themselves say. About 30,000 in the city of Hama, you know, in about 20 years ago. So this is the kind of regime that we have.
There was a certain limited degree of civil opposition to the Assad government, demanding certain changes. The problem was that some of the leading Gulf countries, led by Saudi Arabia and at that time also by Qatar, with strong involvement as well from Turkey, decided that they wanted to get rid of the Assad government.
The United States said, well, we don't give them lethal weapons. We're giving them only communication and help. Well, they don't have to give them weapons because the Saudis, the Qataris, the Turks, the Jordanians and others have put incredible number of weapons and people and logistics and training into the picture. There is here a huge investment of men, fighters, money, logistics, political maneuvering, even at one time came close to using direct power in order to change the regime.
Saudi Arabia and the other GCC countries, Britain, France, Turkey, the United States, representing the forces deployed to overthrow the Assad government. And then you've got on the other side, Russia and Iran backing up the Assad government, each for their own reasons. So the Russians see themselves in a very real sense as being targets of a concert of Western powers combined with the countries of the Persian Gulf.
The Russians and the Chinese all of a sudden are awakened to the fact that they were slapped on the face. They were literally tricked by what happened. And you see, one of the things that came very quickly in Libya is that the first thing the new government did is abrogated all the contracts, long-term contracts they had with the Chinese and the Russians, to the tune that they lost around $50 billion in business.
In Syria, what has happened is that, again, because it was a dictatorial regime, people opposed it. And in the context of the Arab Spring, some of them took arms eventually, but Turkey intervened in it immediately, and Turkey is a NATO member. So the US didn't have to be there.
So you had basically the events in Libya, which created the opportunity to deploy massive amounts of weapons seized from the Gaddafi stockpiles and to conduit them into Syria, into the hands of the rebels. And so we've had this prolonged 3-year crisis where Assad was not about to roll over and walk away from power. So you now see in practice a shallow excuse for breaking up the system of sovereign nation states and creating a much bigger nightmare than even a bad regime.
The basic rationale is the CIA says any nation state is going to try to escape from the empire. So the answer to that is destroy all nation states. Replace them with warlords, with tribalism, with secessionism, or just chaos. But above all, split them up. Sudan split into 2 parts, Iraq split into 3 parts, Serbia split, Yugoslavia split, Libya now de facto split. That's the coming thing. Belgium, it's being done there as an example. Scotland, it's an orgy of destroying the existing nation states. And by the way, the US is not supposed to be immune from this, although I hope it won't work here.
What's being proposed here is not just simply targeted countries slated for regime change, but an overturning of the entire Westphalian system of sovereignty, of respect for national sovereignty. So you now see in practice a shallow excuse for breaking up the system of sovereign nation states and creating a much bigger nightmare than even a bad regime.
In the Middle East since December 2010, what we have had is a wave of popular uprisings in different countries of the Middle East, from Morocco to Oman, Morocco in the west and Oman in the east. And these popular uprisings have aimed at despotic dictatorial regimes, discontent with their economic situation, unemployment, problems that youth have with the whole system. Generally speaking, poverty, mostly in the urban areas, and there are continuation of previous struggles from the end of the Second World War that have been well documented.
One of the things that the Arab Spring has brought to the fore here is that notion that there is Arab exceptionalism, that because of linguistic or religious factors or something else, Arabs are not suitable for democracy. But by God, the Arab Spring had completely shattered this. The Arabs are as desirous, and probably more desirous, and more in need of democracy than any part of the world, but they don't need this international intervention and interference and co-option that has completely derailed and expropriated the will of the people to establish and solidify the geopolitical interests of the West.
If you're like me, you were at least momentarily caught up in the euphoria as the Arab Spring rolled across the Middle East. It was initially electrifying to witness as some of the long-ruling strongmen in the Mideast began to topple over. Ben Ali of Tunisia, Gaddafi of Libya, Mubarak of Egypt, the region's most populous country. Eventually, Yemen's despot Ali Abdullah Saleh would also go. But for me, that euphoria slowly turned to cynicism and skepticism. Then Syria erupted, another spontaneous uprising, we were told. Assad, like Gaddafi before him, claimed his country had been invaded by radical terrorists funded largely by Saudi Arabia. They were responsible for the protests. Then came reports of atrocities on both sides. A series of chemical weapon attacks, which left scores of young children dead, were also blamed on Syrian government forces. Yet, there was evidence to suggest rebel forces, Western-backed rebel forces, were responsible. The truth is often the first casualty in the fog of war. Perhaps forgotten in all this was a story that ran in London's Daily Mail in January 2013. The story read, "Leaked emails have allegedly proved that the White House gave the green light to a chemical weapons attack in Syria that could be blamed on Assad's regime, and in turn spur international military action in the devastated country." The Daily Mail later pulled the article after the defense company mentioned in the story threatened a lawsuit against the paper. Is this the smoking gun, or more disinformation? Whatever the Arab Spring was, legitimate populist revolution or stage-managed, manufactured regime change, a little bit of both, I suspect. There is one thing of which I am certain the Arab Spring was not: a prelude to democracy. And now, I'd like to know what you think. You can contact me through my website, theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid.